Can go ahead and get started. Just a note to our participants, if you send me a note during our chat, I will probably not see it until the very end. So if you have a question for Dr. Varfig, if you would like to drop it into the chat, I will try to take a look at those at the end, but I probably will not see them during the conversation. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to our first Spring 2025 ABS Book Club meeting. Another reminder to please stay muted for those that are just now joining throughout the duration of the conversation. Today, we are joined by Professor Bettina Varfig, editor of the essay collection Rethinking Bach, which all 40 of us have been reading assiduously this spring. She is professor of music history at Emmanuel College, Cambridge, and was previously on faculty at King's College, London. She is a scholar of music and cultural history in early modern Europe and has written books about Heinrich Schütz and most recently, the physiology of early modern music. And I would like to note, she received a major prize from the American Musicological Society for this book, so congratulations to you on that. I'm also happy to announce that if you plan to attend the ABS's Fall 2026 conference at Baldwin Wallace University, we will have more information about that online next year, that Professor Varfig will be our keynote speaker. So welcome to our book club. We're so glad to have you, really honored to have you with us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So this is a little bit of a different experience for our readers because in the fall, we were visited by an author of a book, but you obviously are the editor of a collection of essays in which you had an authored essay as well. And so I wanted to start out by talking about the genesis of the collection and a little bit about the process of putting together a collection of scholarly essays along with your role as the editor. So can you tell us what that is like and how this originated?
Yeah, sure. It basically started with an invitation from the then music editor at Oxford, so the wonderful Suzanne Ryan, who approached me, and because it's part of a series of rethinking X, right? So there were a few already out there, and obviously it was a wonderful challenge to take on. So I was very up for that. And then the interesting thing about the process, I think, was that you just realize very, very quickly that unlike authoring your own book, you're so much less in charge of what emerges. So you have this sort of ideal shape in your head about, yeah, I think we should have something about this, and I would like to approach this person, and so on and so on. And then it just all completely doesn't turn out like that at all. But that doesn't mean that it's not the worthwhile undertaking you hoped it would be. It just means that it is a genuinely collaborative effort, and the individuality of the people who come on board will determine what happens, and then that will determine how the whole shape feels. Now, one of the surprising things maybe was that an idea I had for this collection was that we would genuinely approach Bach studies as a kind of object to rethink from the outside. And so I actually tried to get a few non-Bach scholars on board, just to see what they made of the state of play within the discipline. And that proved almost impossible. So there was a good number of people, probably a handful of people, scholars whose work I really respect and who have done interesting things about reception history and that kind of thing. And they all said no. They all said no, not going there. So that tells you maybe something about how the field is perceived from the outside and what it would take for someone to take on that particular challenge. So that's why there's mainly people who are familiar faces in Bach studies listed as authors, which I'm very glad about. They wrote wonderful things. But initially the idea for the collection had been more of a conversation between Bach scholars and other people.
That's really interesting, sort of an interesting peek behind the scenes. So for example, the four-part structure of the book, was that something that emerged after you had all of the submissions in hand, or did you start out with that as a potential outlining of four large thematic areas? How did the four-part structure emerge?
I think that that was a kind of back and forth process where that actually is a bit like when you're starting out a big project and you sort of have some ideas about how it might look, and then as things go along, that shape changes. So they are sort of they are themes, broad themes that I thought would be interesting to cover. And then some of those became sections and then others didn't. So I thought that something about broadly about different routes into interpreting Bach would be something that needed to be there. So that became the meaning section. And then there was a kind of strand about embodiment, materiality, which partly came out of my own work. That then became distributed because Stephen Rose wrote about material culture in ways that then didn't actually fit with some of the things about bodies and affect. So it sort of became what it is as a process of adapting and reshaping as things came in. Yeah.
So I want to go back to what you said a moment ago about the difficulty of getting scholars outside of the Bach subfield of musicology to contribute. And I sort of want to think about who exactly is rethinking Bach. Obviously, many Bach scholars are rethinking sort of foundational assumptions that have become sort of internalized even outside the field. But beyond that, do you see any evidence that the general classical music public is rethinking Bach, or people, fans of Bach, are rethinking him? Or do you see this as really more of a scholarly pursuit, this idea of rethinking Bach and rethinking some of these foundational assumptions?
I think you're very right to point to that broader context of the public reception of Bach, because I think the two exist in quite close contact and symbiosis, actually. The scholarly reception, the public reception, one shapes the other very much in constant interchange. So the kind of a lot of the scholarship on Bach that emerges at a particular time will be grounded in the wider public profile of Bach at that time. Then there are certain pieces of scholarship that might start shifting that public profile, but that public profile also shifts in response to much wider developments. So I think the main tropes sort of over the 20th century in terms of that public profile have been the idea of sort of the romantic Bach, versus or followed by the idea of a kind of modernist Bach or Pythagorean Bach or mathematical Bach. And these broad perceptions of Bach have then very much influenced the way in which biographies were written about him, and then the way in which research projects were set up and carried out, and so on. So I think at the moment this is I guess Michael Markham's essay in the collection sort of addresses this. At the moment, we're seeing something of a humanizing trend, so moving away from this very persistent modernist idea of Bach as the abstract mathematical genius. I guess what the 1985 statue of Bach on the cover is sort of one expression of that kind of, very unorthodox, the slouching youngster Bach, mildly provocative, is a sort of, was one early departure from that idea of Bach that we get from the sort of the Leipzig statue, the sort of, genius removed up on this pedestal. And I think you see that a lot in the public reception now with novels about Bach, that lovely little book about Bach walking to Lübeck by Horatio Clare, or the play I just went to in London called The Score, which fictionalizes the encounter between Bach and Frederick the Great. I mean, quite amazing that there's a play about this on a London main stage theatre. And it's very much part of that trend, I think, of appreciating Bach as a humane flesh and blood actor in the world. And then that is reflected and furthered in the kind of scholarship that is being produced as well.
Yeah, that's fantastic. The idea of that dialogue and synthesis between the broader public and Bach studies. I think I've already used a couple of times the term subfield or subdiscipline Bach studies, and I want to talk for just a minute, especially for those of us on the call that are not musicologists. I want to talk a little bit about how Bach studies is set up structurally, where sort of how it's set up in the field and how that may differ from some of the ways that other English language musicology functions at the structural level. I don't want to use the word isolation in a negative way, but you referenced the fact that you had a little bit of a hard time getting non-Bach scholars to contribute. And can you talk a little bit for our listeners about sort of the structural position of Bach studies in terms of how it actually administers itself, which to me is somewhat unique in English language musicology?
Yeah, I think it probably is somewhat unique in its intensity and the way in which it through its institutions collectively creates this very strong sense of a discipline in and of itself. So in the introduction, I called it a sort of island. And that is something that is also the case to a certain extent with some of the other celebrated figures in the Western canon. So you do have a kind of field of Beethoven studies that has some journals attached to it and a society and so on and so on. But with Bach, it's just a kind of there's a greater density of institutions, journals, organizations that all contribute to that sense of it being this self-contained field, which I guess is a legacy of the way that musicology first came into being and then was conducted, so grouped around the idea of the great composer genius, and Bach as the first one of those. So the initial model really for how musicology set itself up as a discipline. So Bach was the first composer to have a complete edition made, and Bach functioned as the kind of founder of the whole canon of Western classical music and so on. So it's around that status of the great composer genius that these organizations and journals and institutions group themselves, and transnationally as well. So starting in Germany, of course, with the Bach Archive and the various Bach institutes and so on, but then very much taken up in the Anglo-American sphere. But still, I guess in traditional terms, you would say that the Bach Jahrbuch, which is edited by the Bach Archive, is sort of forms the pinnacle of that idea of Bach scholarship as the model discipline. So that creates a certain exclusivity. It creates a sense that you wouldn't necessarily want to dip your toe in there if you haven't read. Well, actually, yeah, this was sort of my own journey into scholarship was characterized by this, because I did my undergrad here in London, thought I wanted to write a dissertation on Bach, got to Harvard, got to the music library, saw the endless shelves of scholarship on Bach. I thought, oh my God, I can't do this. This is this world that I have no authority to make any contribution to this. So I then sort of wrote my dissertation on Heinrich Schütz and published my first book on Heinrich Schütz, and then sort of came back into Bach scholarship through the back door. I should say that the field has changed quite a lot over the last 20 years. So I don't think you necessarily now have to have published in the Bach Jahrbuch in order to, be regarded as a proper Bach scholar. But that might just be because I have never published anything in the Bach Jahrbuch, so I'm just it's a self-serving assessment of where we're at. I don't know.
Yeah. So we've got this very distinctive scholarly ecosystem. And at the same time, because it deals with really maybe the foundational figure in the canon, in the generation of the canon, when large ideas come out of the scholarly ecosystem, they sort of escape containment. They don't stay contained in the Bach scholarly ecosystem. They escape containment and they go to other parts of the field. And so these really foundational Bach myths have circulated outside of that scholarly ecosystem. And I wondered if you could say just a little bit about that. That's obviously a thread that weaves itself throughout the book, but for our readers, maybe the most clear example to call to mind quickly would be in Ellen Exner's essay about sort of the 1829 mythology, the role of Mendelssohn, and sort of revisiting that. That is an example, as she writes, of a key Bach myth that has escaped containment from the Bach scholarly ecosystem. And I wonder if you could say a bit more about that.
Yeah, I think it's probably the case with, any great figures in history. Well, actually, celebrities now. We all love a good story about the people we care about. And some of those myths are, they prove to be very powerful. And the interesting thing I find is that even if they are proved wrong eventually, or altered or debunked, usually they do encapsulate something important. They tell us something. At least they tell us something about what people see in Bach. They tell us something about, where the importance lies in why we still listen to this and why we care about this. And I think it's one of the loveliest things about being in Bach studies, that there is this global fan club that shows no signs of abating, and sometimes has very much an antagonistic relationship with scholarship. I think, there's that sense. I think scholars sometimes feel exasperated by the way that certain Bach myths just won't disappear. And then, Bach fans might feel patronized by scholars, telling them what they should believe, that kind of thing. But it is that global audience, that global public, that sustains engagement with Bach's music today. The performances, the books, the novels that I said, it's that wide interest that keeps it relevant, that keeps it that keeps us scholars on our toes about what it is about this stuff that is important. So I think it actually really crucial to engage positively and learn from each other and listen to each other and take an interest, because it just doesn't, well, I think in the current scholarly climate, it certainly doesn't work anymore to just lock yourself away in your ivory tower and pronounce on what the truth really is. And it will only it'll only gain traction if it resonates with that wider community. So I these days I do a lot of work with audiences, with performers, just trying out some of the things that happen in my scholarship on the ground and seeing what happens. So rather than going in and saying this is how it should sound or this is what it means, sort of taking it out there and just seeing what emerges in that dialogue. And that's one of the most gratifying things, actually.
I want to keep on with the idea of the role that myth and myth making plays, specifically in the listening experience. And for the jumping off, kind of the runway for this question, I was reading one of Michael Markham's essays. Our readers might be interested in this, not in this collection, but some essays that he wrote about Bach reception for the Los Angeles Review of Books. And in one of those essays, it's an essay about listening to the Bach Chaconne in D minor. Markham wrote, quote, In the moment of listening, the myth is more real and more profound than the facts. That was an interesting statement. And
Mm.
question for you is, do you think that Bach's public mythic profile, and this is borrowing Markham's phrase from the essay collection, do you think that his public mythic profile connects to the moment of listening for some people, perhaps in a very intense way?
Absolutely. I think what he calls the public mythic profile underpins everything about what we think we encounter when we hear a piece by Bach. So how it's performed, how we hear it, how it gains meaning and significance for us, people's expectations, their reactions, it's all shaped by the particular way in which Bach is positioned broadly at that point in time. So in the moment of listening, if Bach is imagined as universal, mathematical, cosmic, then that is where his music will be able to take his listeners, right? Now, he wasn't those things for his Leipzig audiences in the early 18th century. He took those audiences to very different places because they had very different associations with who Bach was. He had a public profile in his own time, and any of those moments of listening over time, they only become meaningful in the context of who we want Bach to be at that particular moment in time. Although I should say that also, I think moments of listening can surprise us, right? So I think there's something, maybe a performance that does things a bit differently, or just suddenly hearing something that hadn't been there before, or that takes on new meaning for whatever reason. So I would say that the performance does also have agency in that moment of listening. So I don't think everything is predetermined about the moment of listening and what might happen. And that's obviously the nice thing. That's why we keep going back to hear the Matthew Passion every year. Well, I do. Because there is always that thing that it might grab you in a different way.
Let me personalize a version of the question that I just asked. For you as a listener, is there a Bach myth that you find provocative or interesting or compelling, despite the fact that it is perhaps not grounded in what we know to be true about him empirically speaking? Is there a Bach myth that you personally find compelling that you almost wish were true or provable?
I don't know. I think a lot of them are compelling in the way that we want to know this man better. So I've always loved the myth of Bach copying out, pieces by contemporary by sort of, composers as a child, as a teenager, by moonlight, and sort of, everything starting there, and we don't really have any evidence for that. I think they are all interesting. I mean, in the way that I just said, I think we can learn something from all of them. So they are valuable in a way, but yeah, but we do want to make sure that there is clarity about the fact that some of these things are myths. And not in the sense that the factual and the mythical are sort of this binary opposition. It's definitely a spectrum, but there are certain things that we want to be careful about just naturalizing as. So I don't know, maybe to go straight in with some of the most problematic things. I mean, the key myth coming out of the 20th century that Bach's music is universal, that Bach is the father of music. It tells us a lot about the Western classical music tradition, where it's come from, and so on, but it also, of course, obscures a lot of what is very much historically and culturally shaped about Bach's music. We don't want to pretend that cultural baggage isn't there. So the anti-Catholic, anti-Muslim, anti-Semitic sentiments expressed in his works, we could spend ages talking about where the agency lies for those, but it is important that people are aware that presenting Bach as universal obscures or erases some of those problematic aspects. So I think Michael Morrison talks about this in his essay very nicely. He says we can, of course, shape Bach in our own image. We can find in Bach what we want to find, but we need to be honest about what we're doing.
I want to funnel down to talk a little bit about your own essay in the collection, your contribution to the collection beyond being the editor. And just as a reminder for our listeners, this is the essay titled Embodied Invention, Bach at the Keyboard. And what Professor Varfig did in this essay was use the Goldberg variations and the two manual harpsichord as sort of a lens for, quote, upending the long-standing tradition of approaching Bach as a bodiless cerebral entity, end quote. Could you say a little bit more about this? And then I would love to move from that into talking about your broader work on the topic of physiology in early modern music.
Sure. Yeah, I guess that chapter was a sort of staging post in that broader work. So I'll probably have to talk about them in conjunction in the sense that the book that came out in 23, Music in the Flesh, it's in the process of writing it, I realized that it tries to answer certain questions that I've had since the very beginning of sort of growing into myself as a scholar, in terms of just having this experience of feeling very moved by music from that period, Bach's music in particular, and just this dissatisfaction I felt with quite a lot of the musicological answers to what was special about this music. So the kind of Affektlehre approach where the idea is that Bach's music represents certain concepts or certain emotions. So, this group of notes represents grief, and this particular motive expresses XYZ. And it just felt to me like it was sort of holding things at arm's length. It didn't quite, to me, capture what it was that just really grabbed me about it. And then what I came across as I delved into the sort of historical materials more were these really sort of intense reports of these very strong physical and spiritual effects that Bach's music was having, and music of that time in general was having on its listeners. And it was just really fascinating to me how that worked. How could music contract your innards and melt your spirits to soften your heart and I don't know, melt your earwax or give you a toothache, or these very deeply physical descriptions of what listening to dissonance felt like. And so that's what I then tried to do in this project, which culminated in that book, trying to think about how these bodies were constituted, that music could do those things. And what came out of that was a much, much stronger focus on the embodied aspects of musical performance and musical listening, and then also an interest in the embodied aspects of composition. And so in the chapter, that's what I try and look at, thinking about Bach as a keyboardist who puts his hands on this instrument in order to improvise, to compose, to perform, and what that manual knowledge and skill contributes to the compositional process. So that's not to say that the head doesn't also contribute. I mean, he's obviously very much in his head a lot of the time with a lot of the contrapuntal artifice he creates and so on, but quite a lot of it actually emerges from what the hands know and where the hands want to go. And so it tries to trace that a little bit. So it's part of a bigger answer to this question of how does this music move us, and how is this music embodied in a way that we sometimes lose sight of when we talk about Bach as this abstract mathematical genius.
In the introduction to the essays, one of the metaphors that you use for the process of rethinking Bach is the idea of mapping and remapping. And you talk about remapping the contours of Bach studies. And in that part, you mentioned some ways or some suggestions of areas that you would like to see remapped, and you gave a couple of examples. And you've certainly already done a lot of rethinking Bach, but I wonder if you could say a bit more about these areas, or perhaps since writing the introduction, you've thought of other intellectual terrain in Bach studies that could be remapped. I wonder if you could talk about that a bit.
Yeah, that was very grand, wasn't it?
It's exciting.
Uh, I yeah, it's obviously it's a slow and collaborative process, right? So any one scholar and any one piece of scholarship will only usually ever push things out a little bit, you know, and push the limit this way, and then someone else will, and so on and so on. But I do think that yeah, there is a lot of exciting um work to thinking to be done if we want to. So one of the things I have been doing a little bit, I think I mentioned disability studies there. One of the things I've been really fascinated by coming out of this work on early modern bodies and how they listen is thinking about uh, modes of hearing that exceed the modern Western idea of hearing as something that goes into the ear and is transmitted to the brain and is processed by the brain, which is obviously part of what happens when we listen. But one of the things that my early modern witnesses outline is very much a mode of hearing that involves the whole body, and hearing music entering the body through the skin, music affecting the inner organs directly in a way that short circuits that cognitive detour through the brain and so on. So I've been looking at non-cochlear modes of hearing, and it's actually a very interesting dialogue to have with some of the things that are happening in deaf studies and so on. And so yeah, I now run some workshops with groups of listeners where we, not necessarily Bach, but we also listen to Bach, and we try and open up these other sensory pathways to a kind of more multisensory way of listening, a more whole body, fully embodied way of listening. So
Hmm.
that's one thing. And I think the other thing that's very much just right out there that you know is sort of topic of the day everywhere is the way in which Bach's music intersects with developments in AI, right? Um, and so the way that this idea of Bach as this mathematical, abstract, cerebral composer has in recent decades led to him becoming the focus of a certain line of AI research. So the attempt to reproduce Bach's compositional processes through AI. I don't know if any of you encountered that Bach doodle that Google put out a few years ago. There was the Bach bot that was actually a Cambridge-based research project. So I have a current PhD student who's doing some of that remapping in that direction, but I think there's fascinating stories to be told there about well, it really comes down to very fundamental questions about creativity
Hmm.
and about what music is. So I think there's a lot to be thought about there still.
Hmm. We have time for some reader questions. I received a few that I forwarded to you, and I think just for the sake of clarity, I'm going to paraphrase them, but we'll go ahead and work through those now. The first question that we have from a reader goes back to something that you briefly alluded to a few minutes ago, which is the idea of agency when we are interpreting Bach's texted works. And what this reader is asking really is, and this is relative to chapter 14, Michael Morison's chapter, Bach Against Modernity. The reader asks essentially, when we interpret Bach's librettos as evidence of his holding a certain worldview, how do we understand or factor in the role of the librettists? And the reader goes on to say, Bach might very well have had the same beliefs of the librettos cited in that chapter, but where did the librettists fit into the interpretation? Where do they fit into the discussion? And the reader mentions librettists such as Salomon Frank, Picander, Neumeister, Luther himself, and wants to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. The truth is that we don't actually know that much about how much choice Bach had, for instance, about which texts he said. He must have had some choice. I mean, you know, for instance, those cantatas he wrote on Mariano von Ziegler's librettos, that's quite an interesting departure from the usual texts he was using. But we don't have any sources that actually tell us this is what happened. Bach was given a text each week, and that's what he had to do, or we don't know if there was a system of censorship. We don't know what degree of agency Bach really had in choosing his cantata texts each week. And beyond that, we will never really know what Bach really believed deep down, or what any of his librettists believed deep down. We can take certain public statements that each of these figures made in publications, and as you're probably all aware, we don't have that much from Bach where he actually talks about, you know, what particular things he thought. So all we can do is reconstruct the context within which he worked and thought. So the things he had in his library that we know he read, and yes, the texts he said, base an interpretation around that. So I don't think we will ever be able to pin down exactly what any of these historical actors really thought about the question of anti-Semitism. We can only reconstruct the cultural context within which they existed and then evaluate the statements they made in that context. So in a historical context that was saturated with certain beliefs about Jewishness, about other religions outside of Christianity, but also outside of Lutheranism. Within that context, that clearly was saturated with certain views, we I think have to assume that a piece by Bach that was presented to a congregation on a Sunday morning would have resonated, broadly speaking, with some of those deep-seated cultural assumptions. So I don't think anyone will ever manage to apportion the exact degree of agency to either Bach or any of the people he collaborated with.
Thank you. The next couple of questions that we have from a reader also have to do with vocal music, although from a different angle. The first question has to do with Wendy Heller's chapter 14, Bach and the Soprano Voice. And the reader just said generally, they are interested in your take on this chapter, and specifically on the several cantatas where Christ is the bridegroom and the soul is the bride, not to mention the instrumentation weaving around the soprano voice. So any thoughts on that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Wendy Heller's chapter is a really useful invitation or even provocation to think about the function and meanings of particular vocal parts, but especially the soprano voice in Bach's music. And I think what has emerged for me is that really you're dealing with a bit of a paradox when it comes to Bach's treatment of the soprano voice, in the sense that if you read some of the literature about sort of, you know, Lutheran literature about how to run a household, or sort of, you know, politics in the broader sense, domestic politics, but also wider politics. In that context, women are often grouped with children as simply subjects of the Hausvater, right? And so in that sense, the use of boy sopranos in Bach's music, it sort of becomes much of a muchness. Is it whether it's a woman singing or whether it's a boy singing, because they both occupy the same kind of status in terms of being subject to the authority of the patriarch, right? On the other hand, there is that very particular feminine threat of the erotic and the dangerous allure of the female body, the female voice, and that is something that is particular to the adult females who may have sung some of those roles, or who may have inspired some of the writing in Bach's cantatas. And I think it is that sort of I think you'd call it that sort of sacred eroticism that comes into play in particular in those dialogue arias, where on the one hand you have that very clearly that paradigm of Christ as the patriarch leading the faithful soul, but there is also, especially maybe with that very sensuous instrumentation around it, there is also that erotic friction that Bach is capitalizing on. There's a long tradition of church composers capitalizing on that sacred erotic potential. And so it's, I don't think it's a clear-cut story about how the female voice signifies in Bach's music. It's sort of multi-layered, and that's part of what makes it so alluring, I'd say.
That's great. That's fantastic. The same reader has a related question about techniques used by the men and boys who sing this music in church. And the reader goes on to say that they recently heard the Leipzig St. Thomas Choir in Princeton's chapel, in Princeton University's lovely chapel. And the reader says, "How lucky can you get?" And goes on to say it was very striking how clear and beautiful their singing was. Other music in this space in the Princeton chapel sounds very muffled. How do they do it? How do they achieve this timbre? I don't know if you feel like you can speak to that.
Yeah, well, I don't think I ever heard any music in the Princeton Chapel, so I can't speak to the particular challenges that acoustic environment might present. But yeah, there is certainly a way in which that particular timbre of the boys' choir is prized, has been prized, and is produced through basically very intensive training. So, you know, that sort of characteristic vibratoless, straight, blended sound where, yeah, they are trained to listen so carefully that no individual voice sticks out. And they are trained very closely on the shapes of vowels and so on and so on. And so it's a process of yeah, intensive vocal training and formation to bring about that very particular sound that may or may not have any relationship to what Bach's boys sounded like. We do have quite a bit of pedagogical singing pedagogy treatises from the time where we can reconstruct certain things about what kind of sound quality they were envisaging, but we don't really know. But certainly now there tends to be a very clear idea about what this sound should be, and then the Thomaner is they're just one of the choirs that have perfected the art of making that sound happen, and it's very powerful.
Thank you. As we wrap up our conversation, a couple of big picture questions. The first is just sort of panoramically backing out and hovering over the process of putting this collection together. Did it cause you to rethink Bach in any significant ways, perhaps beyond or in addition to your own contribution to the collection?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I had no idea what people would come up with, and it was absolutely wonderful to follow along with the process of my co-authors developing these different ideas. And I don't know, maybe yeah, it's hard to single out a particular thing, but okay. So David Yearsley's essay on finding humor in Bach's music in unexpected places outside of the sort of comedy of the coffee cantata or whatever. Um, I don't know. I come back to that a lot actually. So it was. I think yesterday I was amateurishly playing through one of the English suites, the G minor English suite, and so you get to the Gigue, and it's one of those sort of running subjects in 12/8. Da 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 da. Anyway, so he does his thing, subject comes in and then second voice comes in, and it's all like brilliant. And then second half arrives, and again he does this thing that he often does, which is he inverts the subject. But it doesn't really make sense as a subject anymore. It just turns into this sort of collection of notes that I didn't used to hear it as funny, but it now makes me smile. It's now, oh yeah, here we go, Mr. Bach. It's like you do your thing, and it's almost comically nonsensical, but you somehow make it work. And so I really do now hear certain moments in Bach in a very different way, because yes, it's abstract contrapuntal artifice, and you could approach that with a very po-faced sort of attitude, but actually it's quite fun to enjoy the the comic potential.
That's
I don't know,
fantastic.
maybe I should also say more broadly though that looking back on it now, I mean, it came out 3 years ago, and it just feels like that was a very different time. It really strikes me how I would probably do it differently now, just in the sense of, I don't know. I feel like my introduction almost reads slightly flippant now. I think I would make a much stronger case. I would mount a much more rigorous defense of keeping that space for critical discourse open. I feel that, I think I say something. Yeah, no, I don't know. I feel slightly odd about it now. I say something about I talk about Bach scholarship as an island, and then I say, for this island territory, thankfully, existential threats in the form of floods and tsunamis remain a fairly distant prospect. I'm not so sure about this anymore. And I now actually feel like if I was going to rewrite the introduction, it would be a much stronger defense of why we should still be talking about Bach. But it's always these projects are always snapshots of the times in which they arise.
Of course, none of us can escape our own contexts.
No.
You've alluded a little bit to some workshops that you are running on embodied listening, and I wonder if you could just tell our readers what are you working on these days?
Yeah, I'm still thinking about bodies and embodiment, and how we listen and how music affects us, and it's just been one of the most gratifying things to come out of not so much this book, but the Music in the Flesh book, that it turned out that there were all sorts of readers, performers, professional performers out there who really found something meaningful in there. And we've just sort of run with it in the sense of using some of the things in there as creative inspiration to think about how we can listen to this music differently, how we can perform it differently, how we can make it available and accessible to a much wider range of listeners who may not feel comfortable with the particular classical concert ritual that I think is very disembodying in the way that it makes you sit there very still and receive the disembodied sound that the performers over there make. So so I've been doing some listening workshops. I've been doing we've been staging some performances of the Bach Passions that are very immersive, and we have people milling about and the mob actually staring people in the face, and it may well be that, you know, Bach is turning in his grave every time we put one of those on, but the feedback we've had makes me think that, you know, this is something that is worthwhile. So allowing people to be in it in a way that, and to really let themselves be affected in a way that has been revelatory to some of our audiences. And so, yeah, it's that work that's sort of now leading me in the direction of the next sort of bigger research project, which is very nebulous at the moment. So I'm a bit hesitant to sort of, you know, throw it out there. But it's going to be to do with liveness. So the question of what is particular about the embodied intensity of the live musical moment, especially in a context where, for I think the majority of Western urban dwellers, the music we encounter tends to come from a speaker or from headphones, and it tends to become this flat thing. And that's all fine. I have nothing, you know, I think recording technology is brilliant and all of that, but there's something about live music, its potential to remind us of our shared embodied humanity in a context of increasingly overwhelming mediatization and digitization and so on and so on. So it's something about that, something about reminding people that coming into close contact with Bach's music through the physical presence of performers who are using their bodily and mental and spiritual resources to make this thing happen. There's something special about that we want to hang on to.
Well, that sounds fascinating. And if Bach is turning in his grave, then he too is having an embodied response. That sounds wonderful.
I like that.
Thank you so much. This was really a delight. I hope that our readers have enjoyed hearing from you as much as I have. I'm sure that they have. I really appreciate your joining us, especially taking on the role of doing an editor chat, which is quite different than an author chat, and you have handled it beautifully, which is a surprise to no one. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. It's been lovely to chat with you as always.
Yes. All right, book club members, if you have questions for me, you can send me an email, and I will also send out an email to our book club members about our April discussion, which will be a wrap-up chat amongst ourselves, moderated by me, about this essay collection. And at that time, you will be able to unmute your mics and unburden yourselves with your thoughts and feelings about this collection. So we'll look forward to gathering again in April. Thank you very much, Professor Farfig, and goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.